What is the best release type for bow hunting? Of course, each archery release type has its own advantages and disadvantages, but there has to be a best that will lead you to the most well-timed and accurate shots for the vast majority of bow hunting situations. Something that gives you control and helps you make the best shot possible when it really comes down to that moment you've worked so hard for. In all reality, if you can't make the shot count, then none of the other work that you did is ever going to really matter. Shot location is critical, and it really comes down to a well-executed release. Of course, this can be done with all styles of release, but what is going to serve you best in less than perfect situations? We are going to go through all 4 of the main type of archery release aids to help you determine what the best release is so that you can make the right choice and find more success in your bow hunting this fall. First up is the wrist strap release. Arguably one of the most common and best bow hunting release types out there, but is it? We're going to go through some of the advantages and disadvantages of the wrist strap release for bow hunting. One of the biggest advantages of the wrist strap release is your release is always attached to your hand. There's no losing it, setting it down, forgetting it, can't getting it out of your pocket, anything like that. It is always right there, so you are ready to shoot. The wrist strap release is functional in all weather types and in almost every scenario. Depending on the wrist strap that you have, if they get dirty or get dirt in them, you can clean them off and they're still very functional. If it's really hot out and your palms are sweaty or your hands are sweaty, you can still shoot and function this release exactly the same way. And same thing in the cold. When your hands are cold and numb and it's snowy and cold, you can still draw back your release and still execute a good clean shot. The wrist strap release is very easy to use, and it can be used with a wide variety of gloves and still be comfortable to execute a good clean shot while keeping your hands warm. Depending on which type of wrist strap release that you have, they're generally very easy to fix if something were to go wrong while you're on a hunt or in the backcountry where you may not be able to get equipment to fix anything. This is just a simple B3 Hawk release. It runs as a single sear, and so really there is not a lot that can happen to this release that will make it not function properly. One of the last major advantages of the wrist strap release, could also be considered a disadvantage, but we'll touch on that later, is if you needed to shoot quickly, you absolutely can with this wrist strap trigger style release aid. So what about the disadvantages of a wrist strap release? Well, one of the first disadvantages is also could be considered one of the advantages, and that is that it is always connected to your wrist, always connected to your hand. And that means when you're hand crawling or maybe you're going through mud, you could get mud in your release aid. If you're climbing a tree stand, the release could ding against the metal. If you're looking through a spotting scope or binoculars, it could hit and make noise against the binoculars or spotting scope. So that could be considered a disadvantage considering it's always attached to your hand. With the wrist strap release set up properly with the right length, it may not be quite as comfortable to just draw back and shoot and anchor and be able to do that as consistently as a handheld release aid. Another disadvantage of the wrist strap release or any trigger release in general is the fact that we can shoot too quickly even if we don't want to. And it's because we have this trigger as that easy button to shoot that arrow and rid us of any stress that we have, which we most certainly are all under that stress when we're shooting an arrow at a live animal. We also have to understand that not all advantages and disadvantages are weighted equally when it comes to looking at the different release aids and the different release types. The last disadvantage we talked about with this happens to be one of the most important disadvantages that you can have when choosing a release aid, and that is being able to shoot quickly or being able to force the shot. See, this is a much bigger issue. It's not the release's fault, it's our fault, and yes, we can control it, we can learn to control it, but sometimes it can be too easy to press that trigger and shoot too quickly, and sometimes that happens as soon as the pin hits the fur. This disadvantage for bow hunters that use the wrist strap release often has bow hunters switching from a wrist strap style release to a handheld style release just because they cannot get away from being able to force the shot with a wrist strap. If you've bow hunted long enough, you've been there and you know what I mean. So the issue of rushing the shot with a wrist strap style release for me and probably many other archers is probably tied back to the original way you probably learned how to shoot. You went to a bow shop or you learned from somebody that was helping you, and the instructions were very simple. You put the pin on the target and you pull the trigger. and we do that, but what happens over time is we start to adapt and know that when our pin's in the middle, that arrow is going to be gone, and we don't want to miss the middle. So as soon as our eyes see the pin on the middle of the target, we have to shoot because that's where we want the arrow to go. And what starts to happen is we start to hold off the target, bring the pin up to it, and force the shot. And when we do that and practice that way and get in a hunting scenario, what are we doing? We are drawing back, our pin is off the deer, it's off the target, but our finger's on the trigger, we're ready to shoot, and we're bringing that pin either up to the deer or down across its back, and as soon as that pin hits fur, a lot of times we are hammering that trigger, and if you've had these problems in the past, like I have, a lot of times you can't even remember exactly what happened or where the arrow even went. Let me just wrap all this up by saying I truly believe the wrist strap release is one of the very best types of release for bow hunting, but only if you can control it. And when I say if you can control it, I mean you can draw back, you can put your pin on the middle of the target exactly where you want to hit, let it float, be able to move your finger on the trigger with the pin still on the target, and slowly squeeze that trigger until you achieve that perfect surprise execution with your release to get just the perfect release when you're shooting. If you cannot do that, if you cannot control the release, the wrist strap release is likely not the best release that you should be using. Now again, if you do experience these issues, if you're not able to do that, it's not the release's fault. It's not the release that is causing that to happen. It is us, and we can learn how to fix it. But if you're like me, it can be very, very difficult to be able to overcome it when you're in a very pressured situation like shooting at an animal. I know how hard it can be because I personally actually forced myself to shoot a wrist strap release last year just to see how well I could execute under that pressure in those moments. And even after 10 years of not shooting a wrist strap because of bad habits and trying to retrain and relearn myself, I did find myself at times in the moment going back to those old bad habits from even so long ago when I was just a younger kid. If you find yourself struggling to execute properly with a wrist strap in those pressured situations, it might be worth giving up those advantages, the slight advantages that the wrist strap offers by changing to a different release type that may help you or help allow you to shoot the perfect execution when you're in those stressed scenarios or in those stressed moments like bow hunting. This leads us to our next style of release, which is the thumb release. Now, the thumb release is very fun to shoot. It's very comfortable to have it in your hand, come back to anchor. It's easier for most to be more consistent, more repetitive with it, to allow for more consistent, more accurate shooting overall. But let's just go through some of the advantages and disadvantages of using a thumb release to bow hunt. The first advantage is the fact that it is handheld. So for most people, it's a lot more comfortable to be able to shoot and easier to be more consistent with. Another nice thing about the thumb button is that a lot of them have a clip where you can clip them on your D-loop and let them hang from your string while you're in a tree stand or while you're in the ground blind. So it is always at the ready, but it is not always attached to your wrist. The third advantage is that it can help you execute properly by achieving the surprise release as long as you have not practiced punching or forcing the shot with this release. One of the last main advantages of the thumb button is it is still a trigger like the wrist strap release, so you can still force the shot and shoot quickly if you need to. This leads us to our disadvantages of using a thumb release. Now, in some certain thumb releases, different manufacturers, different models, when they clip onto the string or when you shoot, the thumb release itself can actually be pretty loud, and deer and other animals can actually hear the release going off or actually clipping onto the string, or a lot of times you're not going to have that noise with other release types. One of the biggest disadvantages of a thumb release, or any handheld release for that matter, is that it's not attached to your wrist, and you can lose these. They can fall out of your pocket, they could fall off your string if you have it hooked on there, and you could find yourself making a stalk or getting all the way to your tree stand and losing or not having your release. Another disadvantage of the thumb release is exactly counterintuitive of the last advantage of it, which is that it still has a trigger and you can still force the shot. Yes, that could be considered an advantage if you needed to shoot fast, but it could also be considered a bigger disadvantage because it is harder to control the trigger when you know you can force that shot and get rid of that arrow as quickly as possible if you need to. If you practice shooting the thumb button release like this, that means you can have some of the exact same issues that you could have if you were shooting a wrist strap release, if you're punching or forcing the shot, which is ultimately going to cause you to hold off target, hold low, drag the pin up to the middle, and force the shot. This is often referred to as target panic. Again, it is not the release's fault, it is our fault, but it can be very difficult to control, especially if we've already ingrained bad habits with this release type. Overall, this is the type of release many archers and bow hunters go to if they've struggled shooting with a wrist strap style release in the past. But this will only work better for you if you can still execute a good surprise release execution with it. If you're still forcing the shot, the thumb release is not advantageous to you. The thumb release is a great release for bow hunting, but only if you've learned the proper surprise release execution. The third style of release I'm going to talk about here is a release that most bow hunters go to if they've struggled with target panic or punching the release when using a wrist strap or a thumb button. That is the hinge release. The hinge release is fired off of a rotation. It has no trigger, so there's no easy way to quickly force the shot and still accurately hit at what you're aiming at. Let's just talk about the advantages and the disadvantages of a hinge release. The first advantage and the biggest advantage, in my opinion, of the hinge release is that it forces you to slow down your shot. You can't force or punch the shot, so it forces you to be able to put the pin on the target and go through your execution method to achieve the surprise shot. Because of all of this, this could be the most accurate release you can use when in a hunting scenario, but only if you've learned it properly. So what are the disadvantages of a hinge release? Well, first up, one of the things that gives it the biggest advantage is the fact that it has no trigger, but that's also a disadvantage. You cannot quickly force a shot if you need to. So if you only got a really tight window, you may not be able to get that shot off in time. Another disadvantage is that although you don't have a trigger to force the shot, you absolutely still can force the shot by twisting the release. But when you do that, the arrow will not impact right behind the pin. For a right-handed shooter, most generally speaking, the arrow will impact high and to the left of where you're aiming. And for a left-handed hinge shooter, if you force the shot and jerk the release, you're more likely to impact up and to the right. Another disadvantage of the hinge is even in a decent timed scenario, you might not have enough time to go through your full shot process to get the release to fire in that moment. This can be a disadvantage, but it all comes down to you, what method you use to fire your release. There's multiple different methods used to shoot a hinge release, and we've created a video of 5 different ways of how to shoot a hinge release. And some of those methods used to activate the hinge, even though they all require rotation, they're all different. Some of those are better in hunting scenarios than others, at least in my opinion. Another disadvantage of the hinge is that you've got to get your fingers exactly the same in the release. And it might be really hard to do that when your hands are cold, or if the release is cold when you're in a tree stand or in an awkward position. It's really hard to achieve that same exact feel that you might have when you're practicing at an indoor range or practicing on flat, level ground. Lastly, it can be very difficult to execute the hinge release out of a tree stand or any difficult angles, again, depending upon the method of execution you're using to actually rotate and fire the hinge release. Overall, the hinge release has probably helped more bow hunters than any other style of release out there slow down their shot and learn to execute properly in those pressured situations. But unfortunately, you can still get the bad habits of forcing the shot and punching the trigger by ripping through the release like this with the hinge, which ultimately gives you the same disadvantages of a wrist strap and a thumb button release aid. Again, regardless of the release type that you use or the release style that you use, the most important thing is that you're using a release that you can execute with the proper surprise shot under any situation. The last style of release I want to talk about is the resistance release. This happens to be one of my personal favorite types of releases to use for bow hunting scenarios, but I only ever recommend it if you're willing to put in the work to learn it, to execute properly with it. The resistance release just has a safety to be able to draw back, come into anchor, and to fire. All you're doing is releasing that thumb off the safety and building pressure against the release by increasing back tension until the release trips and fires. The first advantage of the resistance release is that it forces you to slow down even more so than the hinge release because it requires more effort and more energy to get it to fire. The way the resistance release functions, it forces you to execute properly with the surprise shot. There is no trigger, there is no easy button to force the shot. And if you do jerk the release, it gives you that instant negative feedback when practicing to know that, hey, when you do this, when you force the shot, that arrow is never going anywhere close to where you're aiming on the target. Because of how the resistance release functions, it forces you to vividly remember where that pin is at when you're on that animal as you're executing and going through that moment in the shot. It helps force you to stay very conscious through the whole moment so you don't have that wonder or that question of, well, I'm not sure where I hit it, or I'm not sure where my pin was when the shot went off. You vividly remember and can see where that pin is at on that animal when you're aiming and executing. Again, the type of release is never the problem when it comes to your execution, but in all honesty, the resistance release is the release that I 100% recommend if you cannot consistently or always execute any of the other release styles properly, especially in those pressured situations like bow hunting. The last main advantage of the resistance release for bow hunting, in my opinion, is that it forces you to take more ethical shots on game. You know you can't force the shot, so in a lot of scenarios, you're not going to rip and force the shot in that split second that you might only have that one opportunity, which results in less wounded game, less missed shots, and a better recovery rate on the animals that you're hunting. So let's talk about the disadvantages of a resistance release. The biggest disadvantage of the resistance release is it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to really learn this properly and have enough confidence to even take it out in the field to bow hunt with it in the first place. If you don't have the time or aren't willing to put in the work to do it, I do not ever recommend hunting with a resistance release. Another disadvantage of the resistance release is the fact that there is no trigger to force a shot and get it to fire. So you could miss opportunities by not being able to get a shot to go off because of the fact that there is no trigger. Again, we talked a lot about the advantages to why that is an advantage with this release, but that could be a disadvantage because of this release type that you're using. Another disadvantage, of course, like the thumb release and like the hinge release, since it's not attached to your wrist, of course, you could let this fall out of your pocket, it could detach from the bowstring, you could lose it. And so that is a disadvantage of this release along with any other handheld release. The last main disadvantage of the resistance release, again, in my opinion, is that you have to practice more often to stay proficient with this. This isn't a type of release that you can break out a couple days before a season, pick it up, shoot it, and be accurate, be on, and be confident in it to take it out to the field to be hunting. This is the type of release that you definitely want to be using year-round and be very confident in it before you would ever take it to the field hunting with you. In the end, no one is going to be able to tell you what the best release type is for you for bow hunting. If you're an avid archer and you've become proficient with all these release types, I'm sure you've asked yourself this question, and really, there's no clear specific answer on what is best. Ultimately, the best release type for you to use for bow hunting is the one you have built the most confidence in. This is done through experience, which is gained through time and exposure in these bow hunting moments. Everyone's experience is unique to them, and I encourage you all to make your own decision on which type is best for you, as no one knows you better than you know yourself. Please feel free to comment your favorite release style and why you like it. Happy shooting, and we will see you on the next one.